The first time Owen Slade noticed the dust, he assumed it was just another pickup rumbling along the distant service road to the north of his ranch. That road, unpaved and mostly unused since the early 90s, ran parallel to his property but rarely saw traffic unless a fence needed checking or some out-of-town hunter got lost looking for deer that didn't exist. His land, 142 acres of mixed flatlands, mesquite brush, and dry elevation shifts, stretched out quietly beyond the paved limits of rural Henderson County, Texas. It was quiet, reliable land, the kind of land you worked, not just owned. And Owen had worked it for 27 years, since he bought the ranch with money from the livestock deal that nearly bankrupted him, but didn't. Now, he didn't just live on this land. He operated a contract-based meat processing route for 3 counties, had seasonal cattle rotations, and maintained a tight shipping schedule with the regional meat distributor who valued punctuality almost more than quality. It wasn't fancy work, and Owen didn't romanticize it. But it was his, and every gate, every line of irrigation, every foot of fencing had been touched by his hands. That morning, just past 6:45, he noticed the dust not fading as it usually would. It grew. It thickened. And then came the sound, low and metallic, not like any pickup or even the ranch utility trucks used in the area. He stepped out onto the porch in his work boots, coffee half sipped and nerves already alert. Through the distant trees, just beyond the slope where the outer pasture fence met the gravel drop, he caught the yellow gleam of something bigger, something tracked. Excavation equipment. At first, his reaction wasn't anger. It was confusion. Nobody was supposed to be out there. That wasn't public land. It was his southern section, bordered clearly by survey posts and fence markers embedded in soil and confirmed in the county's land records. He'd had to prove it in court once after a hunting club tried to claim grazing rights. And now, someone was rolling in construction equipment over his land as if it were theirs. The anger came next, slow and methodical, like a pot beginning to boil. He didn't grab his phone. He grabbed his truck keys, left his coffee steaming on the porch rail, and drove the half-mile down the utility trail that ran beside his cattle feed lines. When he arrived, the machines were already deep in operation. Graders, compactors, a tracked backhoe. A large section of his pasture had already been scraped down, and thick black gravel was being laid over the red earth, crushed and pressed with the kind of indifference that only subcontractors could display. A man in an orange vest stood holding blueprints and barking into a radio. Owen got out and approached without a word. The man noticed him about 10 paces out. "You can't be here without a helmet, sir," he said, not even looking up from his clipboard. Owen stopped just a few feet away and stared. "This is my land," he said, voice calm but stern. "You're about 1,000 feet past any public easement." The man paused, blinked slowly like he had heard this before, then gestured toward a laminated copy of a work order clipped to the side of his trailer. "We're running an approved development access road from County Road 38 to the Ridgemont parcel. Orders came from the Regional Planning Group. You'll need to call them if there's a problem." "There is a problem," Owen replied. "You're building across my ranch." The man didn't argue. He shrugged and pointed toward the paperwork again. "Everything's been signed off." It was a phrase Owen would hear again more than once over the coming weeks. Everything's been signed off. Only it never was. When he checked the regional office later that day, no one could give him a straight answer. The parcel being serviced, the so-called Ridgemont Build, was a planned gated community 10 miles to the southeast. But its developers had petitioned for a temporary access corridor to facilitate early delivery of utilities and materials. According to their documents, the route through Owen's property had been marked as pending approval, a liminal bureaucratic status that meant they had no actual right to build on it, but no one had formally denied it either. Someone had used that vagueness to push forward the work order. And now the road was underway. He spent the next 2 days making calls. The county clerk's office was slow to respond. The land commissioner wouldn't return his emails. Legal aid told him it would take at least 3 weeks to verify if the easement was officially recorded, and even then, stopping construction could require an injunction. And injunctions cost money. Owen had some saved, but not enough to tangle in a prolonged legal fight without jeopardizing payroll or feed deliveries. His options were thin. The machines didn't wait. They kept coming, trenching deeper, bringing in more crews. His back fences were down by Thursday, and he saw a convoy of flatbeds moving across land where he'd once raised his first Angus herd. His lawyer, Janice Merrill, sharp, seasoned, and honest, told him plainly, "You're probably in the right. But if they think you can't afford to fight, they'll gamble on pushing you into submission." By the weekend, the roadbed stretched from one end of his property to the other, cutting a straight, unnatural gash through his terrain. Dust coated everything. His cattle were spooked. Feed trucks got rerouted twice. One of his seasonal workers quit after her truck got blocked by a pile of rebar dumped across the west access point. The insult wasn't just legal, it was operational. The land wasn't just being disrespected, it was being disrupted. Used. On Sunday, he sat in his office reviewing the documentation Janice had collected. There was no recorded right-of-way, no formal condemnation notice, no eminent domain proceeding. Just a project moving forward on momentum and a tangle of assumptions. He looked out the window toward the cattle barn and watched as a crane moved steel tubing through the glare of the late sun. He didn't rage. He thought, calculated, measured, and then, on Monday morning, he took action. He had a section of fence rebuilt across the cut road. Not a barricade, just a post gate. Metal, clean. He added signage. Private land, controlled access only. He printed official-looking invoices and posted a laminated copy at the gate. And at the heart of it all, he built a booth, not flashy but functional, just off the roadside, complete with a logbook and mounted camera. By noon, he was sitting inside, pen in hand. When the first truck rolled up, Owen stood. The driver rolled down his window. "This a joke?" "Nope," Owen said, handing him a printed form. "Access fee. $500 per vehicle crossing private land without easement or rental contract." "You serious?" "Dead serious." The driver laughed, backed up, and radioed someone. Within 2 hours, Owen received his first call from a logistics firm. He answered. His voice was calm. "I'm not stopping you from working," he said. "You're free to use the road, but I'm not letting you drive across my ranch for free." And that was the beginning. Not of war, not of protest, but of pushback. Lawful, strategic, and unflinchingly clear. Owen Slade had spent most of his adult life respecting the land. Now he demanded others do the same, whether they liked it or not. By the end of the second week, the temporary road had become a steady artery of industrial traffic. What had started as a few curious workers and surveyors had grown into a continuous loop of dump trucks, semi-trailers loaded with piping, pallets of concrete forms, and water tankers that rumbled past the toll booth without even slowing down. Owen's signs were ignored. The invoices posted on the gate were ripped down more than once, and twice, a driver deliberately plowed over the chain he'd strung between 2 steel poles. He tried reasoning. He tried standing in front of vehicles and handing out fresh copies of the legal notice that Janice had drafted, citing trespass, land use violations, and temporary access requirements under Texas Civil Code. Some drivers were polite and confused. Others laughed in his face or spat near his boots. One even suggested Owen take his little side business to the flea market where it belonged. The tone wasn't just condescending. It was coordinated. Janice warned him to document everything. so Owen installed a second camera above the booth, one with a wide lens, able to catch license plates, driver faces, timestamps, even load types. He recorded each day's entries in a ledger, noting make, model, time of entry, direction of travel. He wasn't just keeping receipts, he was building a file, something to take to court, if it came to that. But he wasn't naive. Courts didn't move fast, and road crews certainly didn't stop for paperwork. His land was being pounded into submission one axle at a time, and the more he protested, the more they pushed forward. That wasn't oversight. It was strategy. On Wednesday morning, a courier delivered a letter to his gate, hand-carried and signed for. It was from a law firm out of Dallas. Bright, polished paper with embossed letterhead and 7 pages of legal framing. The gist was simple. Owen was being issued a cease and desist. According to the letter, his toll booth constituted a hazard to infrastructure and public safety, and his demand for fees was characterized as unlawful obstruction of state-mandated development. There was no signature from any judge, no citation of any court order, just a threat, expensive, professional, and loud on letterhead. Owen read it 3 times, then slid it into a folder labeled Noise. Janice wasn't surprised. "They're probing," she said, "trying to see if you'll blink. Let's not blink." That evening, Owen drove out to his south boundary line, beyond the recently installed barriers, and stood where the fresh asphalt gave way to native scrub. The sky was open and pale, clouds stretched wide over the horizon like slow smoke. In the distance, cranes marked the perimeter of what would become Ridgemont, an expanse of upscale development no doubt filled with promises of community centers, walking trails, and polished driveways. He had no quarrel with development. Let them build their houses. Let them plant imported trees and advertise wellness clinics and poolside yoga. But not through his land. Not without asking. Not while tearing up 30 years of soil, ignoring clear boundaries, and acting as if silence was the same thing as permission. The next escalation came not from lawyers or machines, but from something more subtle. When Owen went to pick up feed 2 days later, the clerk at his supplier informed him that his account had been flagged for review. Apparently, a routine audit from one of their financial partners had raised questions about the use of access roads and liability coverage on contracted properties. When Owen asked what the hell that had to do with feed deliveries, the clerk shrugged and said it came from corporate. 2 calls later, Owen learned that the logistics group behind the Ridgemont project had financial ties to the same parent firm that backed his feed supplier's credit program. It wasn't a coincidence. It was pressure. By Friday, his cattle transport route was disrupted. A bridge on County Road 42 was suddenly marked as under repair, forcing all deliveries to reroute directly through the freshly laid corridor on Owen's property. He received no notification, no alternative logistics plan, no explanation. Just another workaround that turned his land into public road without consent. He wasn't entirely unprepared. That night he made a quiet call to a contact in the regional assessor's office. A former neighbor, retired but still plugged in. What he heard turned his stomach. Apparently, someone had submitted a set of revised parcel diagrams to the county's mapping office weeks ago. In those diagrams, a corridor cutting through Owen's land had been marked as Future Access Overlay, a meaningless term in official records but often used as a placeholder for pre-approved infrastructure. The maps weren't binding, but they carried weight. If no one objected, they became precedent. "Who submitted them?" Owen asked. "Not clear," came the reply, "but they referenced a public easement application." "I wasn't notified of any hearing," Owen said. "There wasn't one," his contact admitted. "Looks like it was pushed through administratively, under emergency logistics provisions tied to regional development." That phrase, emergency logistics, repeated in his mind like a bad echo. It didn't mean disaster relief or supply chain collapse. It meant someone wanted a shortcut and figured out how to call it legal. Janice's tone sharpened the next morning. They're going to try to steamroll you, Owen, not with dozers. With paperwork, deadlines, default claims. The more passive you are, the more they normalize this road as part of the plan. You have two choices: accept it or formalize your resistance. So, Owen made it formal. He sent registered letters to the logistics firm, the construction company, the real estate developer managing Ridgemont, and the law firm that had issued the cease and desist. Each letter included a notarized notice of land use restriction, a documented tally of all vehicles recorded entering and exiting his property since the road's construction, and a fee schedule detailing compensation due under Texas property law, $500 per crossing, retroactive to the first date of encroachment. The total exceeded $130,000. He enclosed copies of every image, every timestamp, every page of logs, and he sent a copy to the county auditor's office, marking it as a formal complaint of unauthorized commercial use of private land. The response didn't come in words. That weekend, someone tore down the toll booth. It happened just past midnight. The camera footage showed 3 masked figures in black hoodies, moving with mechanical speed. They brought power tools. They disabled the gate mechanism, cut the steel support rods with a cordless saw, and threw the booth's shell into a flatbed. They didn't speak. They didn't spray graffiti. It wasn't vandalism. It was removal. Cold, coordinated, efficient. Owen found the wreckage dumped in a shallow ravine near the eastern ridge, stripped of anything electronic. The SD cards were gone. The backup batteries were smashed. They left nothing recoverable, not even the bolts. Janice's voice over the phone was quieter than usual. This isn't just pushback. They're escalating. We need to get ahead of it. But Owen wasn't shaken. He was awake now, and the fight had just begun. The morning after he found the destroyed toll booth, Owen didn't call the sheriff. He already knew how that would go. A deputy would come out, take a few photos, fill out a damage report, and file it somewhere behind a stack of more urgent rural disputes. Cattle rustling, property line squabbles, illegal burning. No arrests would be made. No questions would be asked. There were no prints, no clear faces, no identifiers on the truck. It would be listed as unknown actors, unknown motive. No follow-up, and nothing to restore what had been taken. Instead, Owen called Janice. She listened in silence as he described what had happened, and when he paused, she didn't tell him to stay calm. She told him to shift tactics. They're using economic intimidation and extra-legal tactics. That tells us they're not confident in a clean legal route. You need to start treating this like a commercial incursion, not just trespassing. Owen didn't wait. By noon, he was driving into the county seat to meet with a land use consultant that Janice had recommended. A quiet man named Colby Darrell who had worked for a decade in zoning compliance before retiring early after a public scandal involving a development firm that bribed an entire planning commission. Colby didn't waste time. He listened, nodded once, and pulled out a map of Henderson County. "They're trying to establish a de facto easement," he said plainly. "You've got something they need. Central terrain, direct access, and no subdivision around you. The cheapest way to get what they want is to normalize illegal usage until the burden of stopping it falls on you. They're not just hoping you'll give up. They're building a record that says you never really objected." Colby was right. The more they passed through his land without consequence, the more the paper trail would support their right to do so. It was the oldest strategy in land fights. Establish a habit, then call it history. If no formal injunction was filed, if no physical barrier stood, if no authorities stepped in, then every crossing became precedent. But Colby had an idea. You don't need to block the road again. You need to interrupt the assumption that it's free to use. The next day, Owen installed a set of motion-triggered tire shredders, removable, non-lethal, but capable of halting any vehicle over 3 tons. He positioned them just past the southern fence break, embedded in the soil and painted to blend into the gravel. He posted clear signs. Private property, caution. Surface defense measures in use. It was legally ambiguous, but not outright illegal. Janice reviewed the language, and though she warned him it might trigger another legal response, she also admitted that such measures had precedent in agricultural land defense. Within 48 hours, 3 vehicles sustained tire damage, 2 construction trucks, 1 logistics van. All reported the incident to local law enforcement. Owen received a call from a county investigator who requested a statement. Owen gave one. All use of his property was unauthorized, the signs were clear, and the road was not subject to any recognized easement. He offered to show the investigator his full legal record. The man declined. Just needed the basics for the file, he said. Not taking sides. That phrase stuck in Owen's mind. Not taking sides. He knew what it meant. No one wanted to challenge the development group openly. The Ridgemont project was tied to federal infrastructure grants and would bring over $10 million in tax revenue if completed. Opposing it meant stepping into a political hornet's nest. No county office wanted to be the one to explain why a rancher's property rights outweighed regional economic growth. The message was clear. He was on his own. But he wasn't entirely without leverage. When Owen returned to his property later that afternoon, he found a visitor waiting at the edge of his barn. A man in a fitted blazer, city shoes too clean for ranch soil, holding a leather portfolio. He introduced himself as Trevor Langston, Regional Asset Director for Caspian Infrastructure, the real estate investment trust backing the Ridgemont development. He smiled with the ease of someone who had closed many uncomfortable deals. "Mr. Slade," he said, "we're here in good faith. We'd like to resolve this amicably." Owen didn't shake his hand. Trevor offered him a buyout, not for the whole ranch, just for the corridor. A 5-acre section, a direct line of road slicing through Owen's land. The price, $185,000, tax-free, with additional allowances for temporary disruptions to livestock. You'd retain full control of the surrounding land, Trevor explained smoothly. We'd handle fencing, reroute any necessary irrigation, and ensure your logistics were minimally affected. Owen didn't laugh. He didn't argue. He said nothing. Then he asked a single question. Why wasn't this offered before you started building? Trevor hesitated, just for a second. There was an assumption, he said carefully, that this would be part of a broader access framework. We were working with preliminary boundaries provided by— You were working with theft, Owen interrupted. That's what this is. Trevor smiled again, this time tighter. We're offering a solution. Owen walked away without a word. That evening, he sent a certified letter rejecting the offer and copied the County Land Commission, the District Attorney's Office, and the Board of the Tax Assessors. The message was clear. His land was not for sale, and its unauthorized use would continue to be recorded and invoiced. The retaliation was swift. 2 nights later, someone cut his northeast fence line and drove heavy equipment through his hayfield, leaving ruts deep enough to kill irrigation flow. The damage took him hours to assess and cost him 3 days of labor and over $600 in repair. He filed a report with the sheriff's office. This time, the deputy didn't even come out. "Can't prove it wasn't an animal or weather," the dispatcher said over the phone. "We'll make a note, though." Meanwhile, his feed supplier terminated their delivery contract without explanation, citing unforeseen distribution limitations. It was the final thread in a web of small, deliberate acts. He was being pressured from every direction. His resources were being starved, his time stretched, his reputation questioned. One of his neighbors, a soft-spoken widow named Marla who leased grazing land from Owen, called in tears after receiving a notice from the same law firm that targeted him, warning her that her lease might interfere with future development plans if she didn't reconsider the arrangement. That night, Owen didn't sleep. He sat at his desk, surrounded by maps, invoices, field notes, and printed photographs of tire tracks, utility markings, and cut fences. His land was becoming a war zone, and his restraint, the methodical, legal patience he'd practiced, was being used against him. But he wasn't going to react emotionally. He would act with precision. The next morning, he hired a private surveyor to remap the entire southern corridor with high-resolution drone imaging and GPS-verified overlays. The surveyor's report confirmed that not only was the road fully within Owen's legal boundary, but that the developer's own markings strayed nearly 15 feet beyond the flagged buffer zone referenced in their preliminary filings. Janice filed a preliminary injunction request using the new survey as foundation. It was a long shot. No guarantee the court would even hear it in time, but it was something, a formal signal that Owen was no longer passive. At the same time, Colby, the land consultant, offered another angle. "They think you're just protecting dirt," he said. "What you're really doing is stopping a logistics route. That has regulatory consequences." With Colby's guidance, Owen filed a formal report with the Department of Transportation, alleging unauthorized use of land for commercial transit without permit or inspection. He also submitted evidence to the Texas Water Board regarding damage to subterranean irrigation patterns, and to the Agricultural Commission, citing threat to livestock access routes. None of it guaranteed a win. But it forced a response, and forcing a response, in a system built on silence and assumption, was the most dangerous move he could make. Owen stood in the center of his land, boots sunk into soil still scarred by treads, eyes following the freshly drawn survey lines that carved across the pasture like a wound reopened. The air smelled of damp hay and distant diesel. He had read the report 3 times already, each pass confirming what he already knew but needed to see in indisputable measurements. His land had been trespassed, altered, and degraded without consent or compensation. The drone scans, precise down to the inch, showed the roadbed overlapping not just his grazing corridor but a section of his west irrigation line, the one he'd spent 2 summers restoring by hand when the droughts had choked his water rights to a trickle. But it wasn't just physical encroachment. This was legal territory now, measurable, documented, time-stamped. It was a map they couldn't ignore, and for the first time since the fight began, Owen had a weapon sharper than protest or negotiation. He sent copies of the survey to Janice, Colby, and a state agricultural mediator who had quietly agreed to review the materials under the framework of unauthorized commercial land use. He didn't expect miracles. He expected silence, and that's what he got. For nearly 10 days, nothing came. No phone calls, no letters, no threats. Even the construction activity slowed. Trucks moving slower, workers clustered closer to the far edge of the property, as if someone had whispered that things might be turning. Owen used the time. He met with Colby twice more, once at the property, once in the county records office. They dug deeper into the parcel chain and discovered an odd detail buried in the Ridgemont filing. A minor amendment to the proposed route listed as revision for access stability, which rerouted several feet onto Owen's land under the pretense of avoiding environmental impact on an adjacent creek bed. That amendment had never been reviewed in public hearing. It was penciled in, approved internally, and never noticed by anyone because it was tacked onto a volume of technical compliance logs. On paper, it was meaningless. In practice, it gave the project's legal team just enough ambiguity to argue necessity. Janice's response was curt and simple. "We hit them with intent to deceive. That afternoon, Owen sent a second invoice to Caspian Infrastructure, this time updated with the new survey, current toll total, and a revised penalty clause for willful misuse. The number passed $180,000. He included language reviewed by Janice outlining potential civil penalties if payment was not rendered, and copied the letter to the county civil clerk. Again, no response. But the next morning, a marked SUV from the State Agricultural Commission rolled up to his gate. The inspector, a no-nonsense woman named Maria Castillo, stepped out and walked the fence line with him in silence, clipboard in hand, boots caked in red dust within 5 minutes. She didn't ask how long he'd lived there or what the fight was about. She asked about the displacement of cattle, water access interruption, and any veterinary records showing abnormal stress indicators in his herd. Owen handed her the files. She flipped through them, paused once, then looked up. They didn't report any livestock impact in their environmental plan, she said. That's a violation. He didn't respond. He didn't have to. She already saw it. Before she left, she said, "You'll be hearing from us formally." It was the first tangible shift. A state-level response, however modest. Not a ruling, not an injunction, but an acknowledgement, one that could no longer be dismissed as the rantings of a bitter landowner. Within 3 days, the equipment on the road slowed to a crawl. Owen observed as workers began avoiding the central path of the corridor, favoring the very edges, clearly trying to avoid further damage or contact. He knew it was temporary, a delay tactic while their lawyers recalibrated. But it bought him time. It also brought the next complication. A white SUV appeared one evening near dusk, parked just outside his southern fence. Owen approached with caution, rifle slung but unraised. A woman stepped out mid-30s, smartly dressed in jeans and a clean field jacket. She introduced herself as Amelia Grant, claiming to be a representative from a land arbitration firm. But Owen noticed the badge clipped to her hip, half-tucked and oddly unofficial. He said nothing, but noted it. She didn't waste time with small talk. "We believe this conflict has regional implications," she said. "There's concern that continued disruption to the Ridgemont corridor could delay infrastructure connections for multiple developments. If we can mediate terms, some form of partial lease agreement perhaps, we might avoid further escalation." Owen asked one question. "Are you here on behalf of Caspian?" She paused. "I'm here on behalf of the region." He shook his head. "You're here because they're running out of time." She didn't deny it. "If you want something permanent, you need to think beyond invoices. This isn't just your fight anymore." Owen didn't respond. He let her talk, then walked away. That night, he called Janice. "They sent someone different," he said. "Someone too careful." Janice exhaled over the line. "That means you're bleeding them," she said. "But now they'll try to shift the narrative. Make it look like you're the one threatening progress." He knew what that meant. They'd start courting the press, whispering to commissioners, turning his name into a headline. So he adjusted his strategy again. He began preparing for the next phase. Not confrontation, but exposure. He documented everything. Every field impacted, every shift in fence line. He hired a local drone team to conduct weekly flyovers. He printed large-scale aerial photos and time-stamped comparisons. He began logging secondary effects, erosion patterns from construction runoff, pasture division, animal migration shifts. Not just for his land, but for adjacent parcels. If they wanted a regional conflict, he'd show them one, in full detail. And then, without warning, his feed contract was reinstated. No call, no explanation. A truck rolled up one morning, dropped the usual delivery, and left. Same supplier, same driver, different tone. Janice smiled when he told her. "That's them backing off. Quietly." It wasn't over, but it was something. The beginning of a turn. Not a win, but a moment of leverage. And Owen knew how to use those. He wasn't trying to win everything. Just enough. Enough to hold the line. Enough to make them think twice before calling his land theirs again. Silence struck first, not as peace but as absence, of accountability, of noise, of hesitation. The road that once rumbled with trucks now buzzed with a quieter kind of traffic. The vehicles were different. Their decals were painted over. The drivers stopped making eye contact, stopped slowing at his warning signs, stopped pretending they didn't know. They moved like clockwork, unbranded, untraceable, and coordinated. They weren't subcontractors anymore. These were hired ghosts, tasked not with transport, but with normalization, erasing resistance through repetition until the trespass itself was no longer noticed. Owen knew this pattern. It wasn't transportation. It was consolidation. A new filing appeared on the County Development Board's digital records, buried between drainage reports and agricultural usage logs. Owen opened the PDF with a click and scanned the language. Buried in it was a line designating a shared resource corridor for interjurisdictional logistical continuity, citing state codes so archaic he had to cross-reference them 3 times just to confirm they were still technically in effect. They were. The proposal named the route bisecting his land, not by name, of course, but by parcel number, and requested emergency reclassification. It would no longer be considered private use or even conditional transit. If approved, it would be recognized as part of the regional economic transport grid. He wouldn't lose the land. It would just cease to be his. Janice called and didn't sugarcoat it. They're bypassing the trespass claim. They're going to reframe the narrative. You're not the victim. You're the obstruction. If this reclassification goes through, they don't owe you anything, not even an apology. It was a move so large, so surgical in its detachment, that Owen didn't waste time being angry. He shifted instantly. He sent the document to Colby. He contacted 2 landowner coalitions, both of which had already felt the pressure of similar developments. Then he printed new versions of his logs, his invoices, and his aerial surveys. The new toll total passed 400,000. This wasn't about fees anymore. It was about liability. He filed liens against 6 involved companies, knowing they would trigger red flags during asset audits, knowing they'd clog transactions, knowing they'd make someone at the top flinch. The pushback was immediate. It wasn't a call. It wasn't even legal. It was symbolic. 3 trucks rolled onto his land, again without notice, and deposited massive concrete barriers along the road. They didn't block access. They framed it as if to say, "This is not his land, this is a corridor." There were no logos on the barriers, no paperwork posted, just 22 tons of physical implication. Owen contacted the sheriff's department. A deputy showed up 2 days later, glanced at the blocks, and mumbled that they weren't technically permanent structures. "Not our jurisdiction," he said, and left. That night, the camera feeds from the road went dark. Not from sabotage. From precision. Wires unscrewed, not cut. Batteries removed, not smashed. Someone had studied the system and dismantled it with surgical efficiency. The next day, his logistics provider blacklisted his property coordinates. Not an official suspension, just a system note. Route instability. It was a silent cutoff. No trucks came, no explanation given, and then came the inspection. 2 vehicles from the Animal Health Commission rolled up unannounced. The agents requested access to soil and livestock records. Something about disease monitoring and compliance audits. Owen knew it wasn't real. He let them walk the field, let them poke and prod, and when they left without finding a single infraction, he still knew what the game was. flood him with bureaucracy. If they couldn't break his claim, they'd erode his foundation with paper. That evening, Colby arrived in person. He brought with him a binder of documents pulled from a friendly contact at a subcontractor office. Drafts, early maps, design iterations, all marked 6 months before the first public filing, all showing the road running straight through Owen's property. It proved nothing criminal. But it killed the lie of necessity. The access was never an emergency. It was the plan. From day one, the filings, the excuses, the appeals to regional benefit, every bit of it was retroactive justification. Owen stared at the map, then walked out to the road. The dust kicked up under his boots was no longer just dirt. It was policy. Somewhere behind a desk, someone had drawn a line across a parcel and decided a man could be erased from it. He returned to his house, wrote 36 letters by hand, and mailed them all the next morning. Each one went to a landowner within 20 miles. He didn't beg. He didn't plead. He documented. Survey images, drone photos, legal templates. A single sentence at the end. If it hasn't happened to you yet, it will. The first responses came quickly. 6 landowners wrote back. 2 had already been approached about access deals. 1 had signed under pressure. He didn't know he could undo it. Owen invited them to visit. They stood together on the rutted path where the corridor split the pasture in 2. They asked what it had cost him. He showed them, and then came the final twist of the knife. A woman from a third-party arbitration firm appeared at his gate, calm, neutral, professional. She didn't say she represented Caspian. She said she was here on behalf of regional cohesion interests. She offered a lease, not a buyout, not compensation. A lease agreement that would pay him quarterly for allowing the corridor to function. Legitimization disguised as compromise. Owen declined. She didn't push. She just said, "We're trying to prevent escalation." He told her, "You already escalated. Now you're asking me to ratify it." After she left, he began preparing for something worse. He knew it would come. Not in daylight, not in ink, but soon. Something irreversible. And when it did, he wouldn't be surprised. He'd be ready. The turning point came not with a crash, but a letter. Thick, certified, delivered not by courier, but a deputy himself. It wasn't an arrest warrant or court summons. It was something worse. A notice of administrative compliance failure. The letter cited a series of obscure regional development regulations Owen had never seen before, claiming he was in breach of non-cooperation under Cooperative Corridor Designation Guidelines. In short, because he had refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the access road across his property, he was being reported for obstruction of a recognized infrastructure asset. There was no attached fine, no court date, just a warning and a form. The form offered a path to resolution, sign the enclosed corridor use agreement, waive retroactive claims, and accept a compensatory settlement package of $32,000. The last paragraph included a phrase Owen would never forget. Failure to comply may result in escalation to enforcement review under State Logistics Code. Enforcement review. It was the softest way to say the state could now move against him. He brought the document to Janice. She didn't flinch, but her jaw tightened. They're testing whether you'll fold. If you sign, they call it resolved. If you refuse, they use this as justification to request emergency intervention. They're trying to make it look like you're holding progress hostage. But Owen didn't fold. Instead, he did what they didn't expect. He filed a response, not with the county, not with the development office, but directly with the State Attorney General's Consumer Fraud Division. He submitted everything: survey data, contract drafts, video footage, drone imagery, lien records, timestamps of unannounced inspections, even copies of local logistics restrictions they had repeatedly violated. It wasn't a complaint. It was a compiled indictment. He labeled it pattern of encroachment, fraudulent use of administrative procedures, and coordinated harassment of private landowner. At the same time, a report came in from one of the landowners who had visited his property weeks before. Her name was Diane. She lived 2 ridges over, and her husband had signed a lease agreement with Caspian under the impression it was temporary. But now, trucks were using her back pasture daily, and her livestock were being rerouted without consent. She filed a formal revocation notice and contacted Owen to ask for his help. He told her exactly what to do, how to file the lien, who to call at the survey office, how to request a protective action through the Agricultural Board. By week's end, 3 more landowners joined. By the end of the next, there were 10. And suddenly, Owen was no longer alone. He was the reference point. The pressure intensified. One of his backup wells failed overnight, electronics fried, wiring scorched. The contractor who inspected it said it looked like a short circuit, possibly caused by tampering. No security footage survived. The cameras had gone offline for 24 minutes that night, the same window the failure occurred. Owen didn't report it to the sheriff. He added it to the record. He treated everything now as part of the case, because that's what it had become. Not a land dispute, but a forensic map of deliberate, coordinated abuse. And then the development firm made their final move. On a quiet Tuesday morning, 2 county vehicles pulled up outside his main gate. One marked as zoning compliance, the other as code enforcement. The officers stepped out calmly, asked for a walkthrough, citing a complaint filed regarding unsafe infrastructure. Owen let them in, followed them as they toured his barn, feed station, and Tollbooth site. At the end, they handed him a notice of violation for unauthorized security structure obstructing emergency corridor. It referenced the booth, the one they had already destroyed. Owen took the paper, folded it, and smiled for the first time in weeks. "You just gave me proof," he said. "You're citing me for a structure your people illegally removed." The officers didn't respond. They just left. That night, Janice filed an emergency protective order against further administrative action, claiming retaliation against an active claimant under property rights law. Colby, in parallel, filed a request for federal oversight review, pulling language from USDA land protection programs and citing the potential violation of interstate agricultural transport security. It was a long shot, but it got the state's attention. 2 days later, an assistant investigator from the Attorney General's office requested an interview. Not in person, not officially. A quiet phone call. Owen answered every question with dates, copies, photos, and names. He didn't speculate. He didn't accuse. He demonstrated. 1 week later, the State Board of Land Development paused the corridor reassignment review. All further consideration of shared resource designation across his land was suspended pending investigation. The Ridgemont trucks slowed. Then they stopped. No press release, no apology. Just silence, again. But this time, a silence that signaled retreat. And then the letters started arriving. Not threats. Settlements. First from a secondary contractor, then from one of the logistics subsidiaries. Offers to settle the liens. One for $12,000, another for $18,000. Janice advised him to wait. She suspected it was coordinated, a strategy to close off liabilities incrementally without acknowledging fault. But Owen wasn't interested in the money. He was interested in the outcome. So he offered a counter. "I'll drop the liens when they drop the corridor," he said. They didn't respond directly, but the next filing Owen received from the county clerk confirmed what he already suspected. Caspian Infrastructure had rescinded its application for access reassignment across his parcel. No explanation given. No one came to his gate after that. No trucks rolled through. The barriers were quietly removed one by one over several nights, leaving only dead gravel and faint tire tracks. The road still cut through his land, but it was silent now. Dormant, and Owen didn't celebrate. He didn't throw a party or issue a statement. He walked the path alone the next morning, boots crunching through dust. At the midpoint of the old toll station, he placed a marker. Nothing elaborate, just a post with a welded plate. On it, a single phrase etched into the metal. Not an easement. Not a mistake. Not forgotten. He left it there, turned, and walked back to the house. The land didn't change, but Owen had. The fences had been rebuilt, the road scar remained, and the grass along the corridor had started growing wild again. But the stillness that returned to the ranch wasn't the same peace that had existed before. It was quieter, yes, but it carried weight. A gravity that didn't lift even after the last lien was closed. After the final letter arrived confirming that no further development actions would proceed without explicit consent. Victory, if that's what it was, didn't come with fanfare or a signed apology. It came with silence and space. They had backed down not because they were beaten, but because they were exposed. And that was enough, for now. In the months that followed, Owen stayed alert. He didn't remove the cameras. He didn't take down the signs. He maintained records as if the fight might start again at any moment. And he kept in touch with the other landowners. The group had no name, no meetings, no website, but it existed. A quiet alignment of people who understood that what had happened to him was not an isolated incident, but a test run. They shared documents. They preemptively blocked certain filings. They informed one another when unfamiliar vehicles appeared at property lines. It wasn't paranoia. It was adaptation. He never rebuilt the booth. There was no need. But he left the post with the metal plate standing. A marker, not a warning, but a reminder of what could happen, of what had almost become permanent. And sometimes when trucks did roll down the distant county road again, unrelated to Ridgemont or any development firm, just regular transport vehicles moving cattle or grain, they would slow as they passed the edge of Owen's boundary. The sign was still there. It made them think. That was enough. One afternoon, Colby came by to drop off updated property maps. They sat on the porch drinking lukewarm coffee, watching wind stir the dust in lazy curls near the edge of the pasture. "You're still on every developer's red list," Colby said, half joking. "They'll never try this land again." Owen didn't answer right away. He studied the line of hills in the distance, the way the fence ran straight through the terrain like a scar that healed just wide enough to remain visible. "Good," he finally said. "Means they'll remember." What stuck with him more than the threats, more than the trespass, was how little it took for a man's rights to begin eroding. Not by force, but by convenience. A missed hearing, a misplaced file. A phrase buried in technical language. That's how it started. It wasn't personal. That's what made it worse. It was designed to be impersonal. Designed to happen quietly. To people too tired or too distracted to notice until it was too late. They'd tried to make it easy for him to fold, to sign the paper and move on. It would have been the clean choice, maybe even the practical one, but it wouldn't have been right. And he knew, somewhere deep, as firm as the bedrock beneath the soil, that if he had given in, it wouldn't have stopped there. They would have taken more, justified more, normalized it. Now, the ranch ran as it always had, slower but steady. Owen rebalanced his shipping routes, brought in a new feed supplier, and replaced the damaged irrigation lines with a more flexible underground system. Diane's lease remained intact. The animals grazed freely again. and the corridor, stripped of legal status, lay dormant, nothing more than a ghost trail over private land. In time, even the track marks faded. Nature didn't forget, but it did reclaim. When Janice finally came out to visit in person, months after the fight had ended, she brought with her a thin folder of closing paperwork, just final dismissals of pending claims, leftover correspondence, and one last document confirming that Caspian Infrastructure had formally withdrawn all interests in the region. She didn't stay long. Before she left, she turned on the gravel step and said, "You know, they'll think twice next time, because you didn't fold." Owen nodded. He didn't need thanks. He didn't need recognition. What he needed was still there, the land, whole and uninterrupted. That was the win, not the silence of victory, but the preservation of what mattered. And when the wind picked up, rustling the dry grass along the southern ridge, he turned toward the corridor, watched it for a moment, then walked away. There was nothing more to defend. But he would always be ready,